you've been in Wyoming 40 years and grew up in a household listening to how people tell stories. Um, do you feel like there's a Wyoming sensibility about telling stories? Is there a Western aesthetic for telling stories?
Yeah, it's not just Wyoming. I mean, Wyoming is part of a bigger context. If you go back to Ruxton, who was doing a pretty good job of trying to record the mountain man stories back in the first quarter, first third of the 19th century, you found a lot of similarities. One of the things he noticed as a phrase out here that is still, common terminology out here is you find things like that. You find phrases from the 1830s that are still current today. I'm dropping any of them off the top of my head. I'll blame that on my age. But the thing that you find is that the Western culture is part and parcel of the American myth. Is that we didn't have a distant past to base a mythology on when we started this country. So we used space instead of time for our myth. And that space was the West, the wilderness. And that becomes it reaches its fruition. It begins with Daniel Boone crossing the Appalachians. But it takes on its final form, and the form that's recognized worldwide is the West of the last third of the 19th century in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, and it compresses the 19th century, the Trans-Appalachian, whether it's Fenimore Cooper or Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett going to the Alamo.
Mm-hmm.
All of those get compressed into, along with the mountain man and the homesteader, and the homesteader is compressed from the 1840s of going to the Willamette Valley in Oregon to the homesteading in Wyoming and parts of Montana that's in the 20th century. That all gets run together. But it all takes place in this mythical landscape that we identify with the West of the cowboy, who is the sort of hero figure of the myth. And that becomes the basis for the story. You can compress even the historic stories, because if you're not part of the culture, you don't recognize the differences between the way, for instance, the cowboy dressed in the 1860s and the way he dressed in the 1920s. And so this becomes, the story encompasses all of that. But the stories themselves, and I like to point out that all the stories I tell are true. I'm just not sure they've all happened yet. But I collect mostly from living sources, and that's stories of things that actually have happened. It's the culture of the ranch and the things that connect to the ranch. Railroading history stories tie into that, because in the trains that stopped in Wyoming, other than along the UP main line, were stopping to pick up cattle.
Mm-hmm.
That was the reason the little towns were there. There was either a set of stock pens or a grain elevator or both in the little towns, and a lot of those little towns were one building towns. They were.
And this would be like post steam engine then, like after they didn't need the water stops anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean the water stops were something separate. But if there was a section house where where they had work crews could stay, and where a section superintendent walked the tracks every day, there's very often, there'd be a water stop, a section house, that would grow into there'd be a community would develop there. There'd be stock pens, but the post office was also the store, and maybe a cafe. And you still find these little towns. I mean, Leiter is one of my favorite. It's one building. It is a post office, a grocery store, a cafe, a bar, and a dance hall, and a couple that own it live upstairs. I mean, it's, and that's, what else do you need to have a town? But the point is that the Western story is all of these things tied together, and the joke of the cowboy. How do you tell a cowboy around a boomtown in Wyoming? Well, he's the guy wearing running shoes and a gimme cap, so you won't mistake him for a miner or oil field worker or whatever.
Somebody who's dressing less.
Yeah, and because everybody recognizes the myth and wants to be part of it. And that extends into the storytelling, is that people will consciously or probably unconsciously pick up the tone and texture of that laconic, laid-back, dry humor, laugh about the things that aren't funny. And I used to go to the International Humor Conference and present papers on Western humor. And the basis of my paper, I did it like 4 or 5 times, the basis of it was exploring the fact that humor in a ranching community, and by context, a lot of what happens out here is based on the fact that it was, an old cowboy said to me one time, anything that you can laugh at can't hurt you. It can still kill you, but it can't hurt you. And so you laugh about the weather, the bank, and the government, because those are the 3 things that regulate your life that you have absolutely no control over. And that's, and so you laugh about those things because that's a shield, that's a protection. And it takes on the form of very laconic, dry wit very often. It's not so many of the stories out here, if you're not paying attention, you'll miss the punchline because it's delivered just as part of the story. And very often the stories have multiple punchlines. So they're very often there's a climax and then a conclusion. And there may be a punchline in both of those. The idea that you're this rugged individual, is part of the myth, but in reality, the folks that live out here, as the old line of the rugged individual is the guy on one end of the rope. The people that work together are the guys on the other end of the rope. And ranching is very much that way. The old-fashioned way of branding is everybody on the creek. You go from one ranch to the next, and you make a party out of it. And you brand here one day, and then 2 or 3 days later, after you've gathered those pastures, you brand at the next ranch, and it's a party. You can if you've got everything in and going, and you've got a crowd there, you can get a lot of work done in a half a day, 3/4 of a day, and then you have a picnic, and everybody relaxes, and you have a good feed, and visit, and party a little bit. Not unknown to have a dance, with some of these, especially the last one of a string that you're going to do.
Is that culture, the dance culture? Because I know a lot of places around Laramie used to have dances all the time. Like the people would come down to Jim or to Woods Landing and other ranches, and there'd be a band and they'd have a dance. But I don't think they've had one in the 7 years since I've been in
Yeah, I
Wyoming.
mean that's a part of the culture that's dying out, and it's dying out
Because the youth is leaving, or?
well, I mean, the main thing is that that was what you had for entertainment. You know, if you want, you know, and it was hard to go to town. So, you know, the schoolhouse or the community center, which were very often the same building, you know, these rural communities, you'd have a rural school or a community hall, and you'd get together every once in a while and have a party. People would bring food, and you know, and you'd generally, you know, there were a fiddler and maybe a mandolin player and a guitar player, and if you were really plush, there was a piano in the community center, and you made your own music and you had your dance. Well, now if you want to go to a dance, you know, you hop in your, even if the roads aren't good, you hop in your four-wheel drive pickup, and it's, you know, an hour to town, you know, on, you know, even if the weather's a little iffy, and the bars all have jukeboxes and very often live music on the weekends when you've got time to go to a dance. And it's you know, the demise of a lot of that older culture here has been the result of bob wire and pickups. You know, that you can, you know, you don't have to do the community brandings anymore. If you've got small enough pastures, you can brand on your own. But the main thing is the pickups, the four-wheel drive, you know, even on the gravel roads and things, you can still get around most of the time. One of the characteristics of the Western story is the lack of culture that some individuals have, and I don't mean high culture, I mean any culture at all. It was pretty easy to be a hermit out here without trying to be. You know, and guys that spent a lot of time by themselves, that's a pretty good way to become an eccentric. And so there are whirls of stories of eccentricities that people develop in isolation. And we've all got these stories of these old characters, and that's what we call them. He was a character, you know, meaning he did not fit easily into society. And those people are fewer and fewer, because it takes a conscious effort now to maintain that sort of isolation. Because even if you don't go to town very often, you know, you can have contact with the rest of the world. Television comes on satellites now. You can get on the internet and go anywhere in the world. It's harder to be an isolate than it used to be, and that was what created so much of the texture of this part of the world. Was it was so big that you could be isolated. And it's harder and harder. Step away from the West for a moment. There's a wonderful Flannery O'Connor short story about a grandfather who's raising his grandson, and they go to the city on the train and get lost. And of course, the grandfather does not want to admit that he's lost. You know, and it is just wonderfully funny and a little bit scary, because they are aliens in a strange land. You know, they've traveled 20 miles. You know, and this is the kid. The kid always says it's not his first trip to the city. He was born in the city. You know, but he doesn't, you know, he left when he was 2 weeks old. You know, but it is, you know, that the whole country was that way at one time. The urban and the rural were so separate. And so that thread of that isolation that runs through Western stories was recognizable, not just here, but throughout the Western world. I told stories in Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, in England, in little farming communities. They recognized all of those stories, because that was an isolated part of England until recently. And so the older people were just, they knew somebody like, they had their characters too. And so that's the humor out here is often defensive, and it's also pretty bleak humor in an old cowboy told me that any wreck that wasn't fatal was probably going to be funny. And even when it happens to you, I mean, I'll look back on horse wrecks I was in 40 years ago, and God, they're funny now. They were far from it at the time. It takes a little distance to appreciate the humor sometimes, but they were comical, and that plays into the humor out here too. And again, it's defensive. It's, oh, I wasn't hurt. Any of it's kind of funny. That sort of.
What do we get out of telling those stories about ourselves? I mean, is it a shared humility, really? I mean, even though you said that would be defensive, usually when we tell a funny story about something stupid we did, it seems like there's an "aw shucks, I'm admitting this," but it
is in some ways it's that, but in another way it is your bona fides. It makes you part of the community. The old phrase, there never was a horse that couldn't be rode, and there never was a cowboy that couldn't be throwed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is when you talk about the wrecks you were in, you are including yourself into that community. And so it's an inclusive way of telling the stories, where if all the stories you tell are about other people, then you are not yourself necessarily part of that community. Where if you include yourself in it, and it's, if you only include yourself in the heroic ends of it, people begin to roll their eyes, because the best of the best have had bad days. I mean, you look at the best ropers and they're all missing a digit or two. They've got their finger between the dally and the saddle horn at some point. The best bronc riders, they're crippled up. So if you don't include yourself, then you are an observer and not a participant.